I'm going to read Arthur Rosenberg's Fascism as a Mass Movement from 1934, and this was republished in Historical Materialism in 2012. Fascism as a Mass Movement. 1. Forerunners and Pogroms. The touching story of Hitler and his first 6 disciples, the story of how jointly they founded the party and how after that these 7 men became first 1 million, and then 6 million, and then 30 million, 40 million, the whole German people, belongs to the permanent inventory of National Socialist speeches. Behind Mussolini there is a similar story, but just as the Duce's grand and imposing qualities surpassed those of his jaded imitation, the Führer, so did the founding party of his party outstrip that of Hitler's in sheer stateliness. There were no fewer than 145 participants at the first Congress of the Italian Fascists that had assembled on the premises of the Commercial School in Milan on the 23rd of March 1919. Yet here too the ascent was utterly dizzying, from these 145 individuals to as many thousands, then to millions, and finally, if you believe the official spokespersons and statisticians, the entire Italian nation. This expansion from tiny handfuls to a mass movement of millions overrunning entire nations is indeed puzzling. Not only the supporters of fascism, but even many of its opponents felt that they were confronting a riddle. Many of those who would write about fascism had heard something at one time or another, about sociology or about the class theory of Marxism. Thus began the search for that class, or more vaguely for that layer of people that made this miracle possible. Unfortunately, the theory of social classes is not quite as simple as it appears at first glance. Anyone seated in front of the piano can start thumping the keys, but that does not make him a musician. Likewise, juggling around with social classes does not amount to a social analysis, and least of all to a Marxist one. Sociological dilettantes generally came to the conclusion that the mysterious class that helped Hitler and Mussolini to power was the petty bourgeoisie. The greengrocer Fritz Schulz became a truly demonic power. With one hand he kept the working class in check, and with the other, capitalism. Schulz is the very epitome of Germany, and the master of a new century. Now, as a person, Schulz may well be a true hero. He may well have won all possible distinctions of war through his role in the trenches, and could well be the champ in his borough. But here we are not dealing with Schulz as a person, but with Schulz the greengrocer, the petty bourgeois. It is really remarkable that the petty bourgeoisie as a class should have overrun Germany, Italy, Poland, Austria, and half a dozen other countries, and that the rest of the world was likewise threatened by the prospect of going petty bourgeois. There was a period in the history of Europe when the petty bourgeoisie as a class, that is, master craftsmen and small traders organized in their respective guilds, actually did play a major role in economic life and production. This was the case during the later Middle Ages. At that time, there existed neither a proletariat nor capitalism in the modern sense. This was the golden age of the guildmaster. But not once in those days, when the guildmasters had all the trumps in their hand, economically and ideologically, could they succeed in governing any of the large European nations. In Germany, it is true, the guilds did wield power in a number of cities, but on the national scale they lived in wretched submission to the nobles of the countryside. And wherever the cities themselves emerged as real political and military powers, as in the Hansa, the leadership lay not in the hands of the master craftsmen, but in those of the big merchants. Starting in the 16th century, every new generation of Europe saw a further reduction in the social weight of the petty bourgeoisie. Thus 500 years ago, when craft production encountered fertile soil and unmechanized manual labor formed the chief source of all values, the petty bourgeoisie was even then too weak to capture political power. And today, in the age of assembly line production, aircraft, and electricity, how has this petty bourgeois suddenly become insuperable simply because he puts on a brown shirt or a black one and Hitler and Mussolini scream out at him? You may as well say that a properly lit wax candle gives more light than the most powerful electric lamp. But several contemporary writers see the causes of fascism not in the petty bourgeoisie so much as in the youth, or even in both at once. The theory of the youth as the basis of fascism is even more remarkable than the one about the petty bourgeoisie. The distinction between young persons and the older generation has existed for as long as humanity itself, and will continue to do so as long as beings of our constitution inhabit the planet. Yet youth as such has never formed itself into a political movement, for all the specific forms in which mankind as such is divided within itself are likewise forms that divide the youth. Is it conceivable that there will come a time when the sons of bank directors will decide to unite with the sons of engineering workers to jointly smash all the privileges enjoyed by the bank directors and all the organizations of engineering workers, and on their ruins establish the brilliant fascist League of Youth? The debate about theories of fascism is not simply a pastime for people who sit at desks and speculate about sociology. In reality, it is a bitter and serious affair of extraordinary practical and political importance for the working class. If you want to smash your enemy, you must first have a precise knowledge of him. The fantastic and utterly illogical explanations that circulate regarding fascism have created the strange conviction among Democrats and Socialists that there is something quite irrational about their main enemy, something that defies argument. The emergence of fascism is then comparable to a natural phenomenon, for example, to an earthquake, a sort of elemental power that bursts from the hearts of humans and tolerates no resistance. And often enough the fascists themselves promote such conceptions, especially in Germany, where they proclaim that the reign of reason and of mechanical logic has now finished, that today the emotions and primal instincts of the nation are again supreme. Sometimes socialists and Democrats feel that they have finished with political opponents of the usual sort, but they despair of ever stemming the onslaught of this new religion. Desperately, people search for the means by which the fascist offensive can be fought back. People break their heads thinking up ways of winning over, or at least neutralizing, this petty bourgeois, who has suddenly become the arbiter for the fate of whole nations. Others want to adapt the level of their own party or movement to that of the youth. In spite of all that, sometimes these people doubt whether it is at all possible to withstand the new political cataclysm. The fascists cunningly exploit this mood of panic, as they did particularly when it appeared among the Democratic and Socialist supporters following the German elections of 1933. Such demoralization is designed to make it possible for any more or less bankrupt reactionary politician to overthrow the most deeply rooted conceptions of freedom and the most solid workers' organizations simply by donning a colored shirt, training a band of immature youth, and dishing out public speeches on the rights of youth or on national redemption. Today, it is more necessary than ever for workers not to let themselves become confused and demoralized. When the fog that fascism creates in all countries clears away, behind it one sees an all too familiar figure. This character is of course neither marvelous nor mysterious. He brings no new religion, and certainly no golden age. He comes neither from the ranks of the youth nor from the mass of the petty bourgeoisie, even if he is an expert at deceiving both of these groups. He is the counter-revolutionary capitalist, the born enemy of all class-conscious workers. Fascism is nothing but a modern form of the bourgeois capitalist counter-revolution wearing a popular mask. Strictly speaking, it is not entirely correct to apply the same term fascism to movements as disparate in character as Mussolini's party in Italy and Hitler's party in Germany. To see this, one has only to recall that the very cornerstone of Nazi ideology, the Jewish and racial question, are very largely ignored by Italian fascism. However, the usual political terminology of today calls all capitalist counter-revolutionary movements fascist once they acquire a mass character and simultaneously rely on an active party force specifically trained for civil war. Ever since the modern form of production emerged, capitalism has dominated all civilized countries. However, it is not difficult to see that the capitalist class was never in a position to force its will on the mass of people directly through any violence of its own. It is a comical idea to imagine factory owners and bankers taking to arms and subjugating the rest of the population with rifles and sabers. The old feudal aristocracy could still govern by relying on its own physical power. In the Middle Ages, knights in heavy armor were actually superior to the other classes of the population in terms of military strength. So, too, in a country where power lies in the hands of the mass of the workers or peasants, the exercise of physical force will lie directly in the hands of the ruling class. By contrast, the capitalists are compelled to rule indirectly. Just as they do not hammer and forge their own commodities and do not stand behind the counter and sell those commodities to their customers, they cannot themselves constitute their own army, police, and electorate. They need assistants and servants to produce, to sell, and to govern. In every country, the capitalists rule only so long as decisive sectors of the population feel at one with their system, are ready to work for them, to vote for them, to shoot others on their behalf, all in the conviction that their own interests demand the preservation of the capitalist economic order. The assistants and servants who consciously or otherwise work on behalf of capitalism in Europe today are as numerous as they are variegated. In the first place, in almost all countries where the capitalist system prevails, it has in one form or another put up with representatives of the traditional pre-capitalistic feudal order. Monarchy and nobility, church and army, and the upper bureaucracy have all evolved from the feudal period into modern capitalist times. At first, of course, the bourgeoisie had to establish its claim to power against the aristocracy in a revolutionary way. It came forward as the representative of the entire nation in the latter's struggle against a privileged feudal minority. It united all of the middle and lower strata around its banner, and in this way forced the feudal lords to capitulate. But as soon as victory was won in this struggle, the capitalists quickly sought a compromise with the feudal elements, so as to present a joint front with them against the democratic and even socialist aspirations of the masses of the poor. From the feudal tradition there sprang the ideologies of authority, discipline, and of military virtues and forms of life, which are so crucial to the understanding of fascism. Likewise, the estate of the intellectuals emerged out of the old feudal order into the modern bourgeois period. It resigned itself to the new form of society exactly as it had earlier to the aristocracy. But because the intellectual does not stand directly within the process of production, does not himself create surplus value, but only lives off surplus value, and that too indirectly, he retains a special position, Sonderstellung, even under capitalism. In general, he is quite convinced that he represents not only the commercial interests of the capitalists, but the general interests of the nation. However, because unfortunately private property is essential to the prosperity of the nation, the average European intellectual finds himself compelled to support capitalism and reject socialism, reluctantly of course. Because the intellectual estate is professionally involved in representing general interests and general conceptions, it is especially well positioned to extract the sweet pap of national self-sacrifice from the bitter reality of the class struggle. Finally, below the capitalists in the social pyramid come the peasants and craftsmen. Their social weight varies from country to country according to the special conditions of development. Even lower in the scale at the bottom comes the enormous army of wage earners. They are all more or less vulnerable to the enticements of capital. This is true not simply of the peasants and craftsmen. In Germany, even before Hitler's rise to power, a significant portion of wage employees, Arbeitnehmer, voted for the bourgeois parties, and in England, even today, a substantial section of the working class supports the conservatives. It follows that the political dynamics of the capitalist countries of the 19th and 20th century has always been a hugely complicated affair. The particular equilibrium of capitalist society has always depended on a multiplicity of distinct and seemingly opposed forces. The great bourgeois mass movements of more recent European history belong to two specific types, the liberal and the anti-liberal. Fascism is the most recent example of this second category of anti-liberal bourgeois mass movements. The bourgeois liberalism of the 19th century was founded on free competition. It demanded freedom and peace. In domestic politics, freedom meant the removal of state compulsion, above all, a wide-ranging economic autonomy that delegated to the state the notorious role of night watchman. Free trade and peace were the complements of this system in foreign policy. They promised humanity a golden age where for the first time the free play of economic forces could unfold without hindrance throughout the face of the globe. This liberal gospel of freedom, free trade, and peace inspired the popular masses, the middle classes, and often even the workers. In England, liberalism was dominant in the years following the electoral reform of 1832, at first without challenge, or almost so, up to 1866, then down to the World War, both alternating and competing with a restructured conservative party. In Germany, it attracted the mass of people from 1848 to about 1878. Thereafter, down to the war, it commanded the support of a minority. Clearly in Germany, liberalism could never flourish quite as smoothly as it did in England. Its brief dominance was never founded on its own strength. On the contrary, it had to be satisfied with the crumbs of political power thrown to it by the feudal monarchy. In France, the liberal era lasted from 1830 to 1848 under the bourgeois monarch Louis-Philippe. Then came the period of the dictatorship of Napoleon III, which lasted until 1870, and was followed once again by the liberal republic, which clearly found it hard to keep itself going against the onslaughts of the anti-liberal movements of the decades preceding the war. From its inception, the Italian monarchy bore the appearance of a liberal state, although behind this facade all manner of other far from liberal forces lay concealed. In Russia, in the period before the war, the bourgeoisie likewise professed liberalism. Obviously, under Tsarism, its political power was even more tenuous than the influence enjoyed by its counterparts in Germany. In all the major European countries mentioned above, liberalism encountered other tendencies that naturally shared with it its firm support for the capitalist form of economy, but wanted to have nothing to do with liberal principles. These tendencies rejected the purely night watchman role of the state and demanded in its place strong intervention from the public authority in economic life. To liberal free trade they contraposed protectionism, to liberal pacifism and aggressive imperialism. They cared little for international harmony and put the nation above everything else. They rejected democratic notions of equality and instead put the main emphasis on traditional forms of hierarchy. They aspired to being purely indigenous, bodenständig, and sought to restore respect for authority. The economic background to this change from liberalism to a new authoritarian conservatism was understood quite some time back, an internal transformation in the capitalist process of production. Capitalism evolved from the period of free competition to the new era of massively concentrated giant enterprises with their drive to monopoly. This new monopolistic capitalism insulates its national economic sphere by protective tariffs. It uses violence and territorial expansion to try to win new countries for further exploitation. It finds the sedate, pacifistic ideology of the liberal era quite useless for its purposes. It demands authority, centralism, and violence. It is precisely the biggest and most powerful capitalists, the owners of giant monopolistic enterprises and of the financial institutions linked to them, who were the first to abandon the hackneyed soil of liberalism and turn to the new imperialist methods. The vast majority of middling and small capitalists remained faithful to the liberal tradition for much longer. To capture state power, the capitalists opposed to liberalism are compelled to enlist allies in other sectors of the population. The most astute leaders of the new imperialism managed to outdo even the liberals and the bourgeois democrats in their demagogy. Sometimes, under the slogan of national defense of the poor, they even fight the narrow-minded moneyed interests of liberalism. There is scarcely any doubt that modern fascism belongs with this type, and that it has developed the nationalist propaganda characteristic of this kind of politics to perfection. In England, it was the Conservative Party, renovated by Benjamin Disraeli on imperialist foundations, that gave the franchise to urban workers in 1867 to draw them away from liberalism. The result was that in 1874, the Conservatives for the first time won a majority in the House of Commons, thanks to the electoral support they received from workers. In England, under Disraeli and later under Chamberlain, the Tories were supported by the bulk of the aristocracy, the big city financiers, the owners of heavy industry, the great mass of the intelligentsia, and major sections of the industrial working class. All these elements were brought together behind the slogan of national greatness. On the other hand, broad strata of the middle and small capitalists, the petty bourgeoisie, and even the countryside remained faithful to liberal ideals. In France, the right wing was financed after 1871 by the big banks and heavy industry. The French national right proclaimed revanchism, the idea of a victorious war of revenge against Germany for the restoration of France's national honor, lost at the Battle of Sedan. A general attempt was made to revive the militaristic and monarchist traditions of the past. Nobility and church enlisted in the service of this patriotic movement. The liberal republic was denounced as cowardly and unpatriotic, and there was a longing for the dictatorship of a national redeemer. In the 1880s, this role devolved on General Boulanger, who, as voting patterns would show, did temporarily enjoy the support of the majority of the French people. Around the turn of the century, the French Republic was again seriously confronted by the threat of a military coup d'etat, which had some popular backing. The French right based itself on the upper classes of French society, on sections of the petty bourgeoisie, and on groups of workers who had been duped by them, whereas the socialist workers and large masses of the petty bourgeoisie fought passionately for republicanism and democracy. In Germany, after 1878, the old-style liberals lost their majority in the Reichstag. Heavy industry turned to protectionism and involved a program of colonial, military, and naval expansion in league with the aristocracy. The intelligentsia drew its inspiration from military discipline and the Prussian spirit. Democracy was a despicable, un-Germanic intrusion. The bourgeois Lebensideal was modeled on the figure of the reserve officer. After 1878, in the Protestant areas of Germany, the rural masses were followers of the Conservative Party, DKP. Likewise, significant sections of the petty bourgeoisie swung to the right. Heavy industry and its intellectual lackeys transformed the old national liberals so radically that of liberalism only the name survived. The liberal banner was bequeathed to the tired hands of the pure liberals. In the Reichstag elections of 1887, under Bismarck's leadership, the conservatives and the national liberals, bound up with heavy industry, together won the majority. Of course, social democracy expanded rapidly under Wilhelm II, but the old-style liberalism was so emasculated by now that in the Reichstag the conservatives, together with the national liberals and the Catholic Centre Party, controlled a secure majority. And so in Germany too, as in England and France, the last third of the 19th century and the early 20th century saw a retreat of traditional liberalism and its displacement by a newer nationalist imperialist force. In Germany too, by newer nationalist or imperialist forces. In Germany too, the imperialists formed an alliance with the army, the church, and the intelligentsia. However, prior to 1914, Germany did not see any grand or unified nationalist mass movement. The different wings of German nationalism remained divided. The reason for this is not hard to understand. The Kaiser's regime was so strong that it could survive without the support of popular votes and parliamentary majorities. It sufficed if sufficient national imperialism, der nationale Imperialismus, in Germany could control the imperial regime. On that basis, it could get whatever it wanted, and it could afford to dispense with the bother of demagogic campaigns to win votes and so on. The ruling classes of imperial Germany did not need the expedient, die Mittel, of democracy to the same degree as the upper classes of France and England clearly did in those years. Court chaplain Stocker's attempt to assemble a populist, anti-liberal, and anti-socialist mass movement in the towns and cities was discouraged by the imperial government itself. For any movement of this kind would have forced the ruling circles in Germany to make definite concessions to the greedy masses, and they had no intention to this sort of policy. The Kaiser and big capital felt safer with the protection afforded by the Potsdam Guard than with the good graces of Stucker's mass congregations. This interplay of liberal and anti-bourgeois forces that largely shaped the development of England, France, and Germany from 1871 to 1914 appears to be missing in the corresponding period of Italian history, but this is merely a semblance. The various tendencies described earlier were present here as well. Here too, liberalism of the old style was gradually pushed back by the imperialism of big capital, Großkapitalistischen Imperialismus, which in the decade following the war led directly to the Tripolitan War of 1911-12 and to active involvement in the Balkans. A drummed-up nationalism directed its sharpest attacks against Austria, demanded the emancipation of its unredeemed Italian brothers in Trentino, and Trieste, and used every conceivable means to catch up with the more prosperous superpowers in Northern Europe. However, the official party politics of Italy was completely immersed in the swamp of semi-feudal corruption, with its breeding ground and the backward districts in central and southern parts of the peninsula. The truly active social forces of the country found in its parliamentary system either no expression at all or only the most imperfect one. In Russia, too, in the period just before the World War, the big bourgeoisie deserted to imperialism and geared itself for the conquest of Constantinople and other rapacious projects formulated by the Tsar's ministers. These were also years when the Tsar's police agents attempted to create a mass movement loyal to the Tsar as a counterweight to the revolution. They brought up the dregs of the lumpen proletariat with liquor and money and created true Russian trade unions led by the police as alternatives to the banned socialist unions. Yet Russia did witness a significant mass movement, the Union of True Russian Peoples, or Black Hundreds, which showered itself in glory with the pogroms it conducted. In both parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was liberalism that initially dominated the Constitution of 1867. The so-called liberals of Hungary clearly belonged to a category apart. They came from the landed aristocracy and moneyed bourgeoisie, and they suppressed the broad mass of people with unsurpassed violence. Thus, Hungarian liberalism did not, strictly speaking, need to accomplish a transition to specifically imperialist methods. Hungary's brutal political regime came wrapped in the cloak of a wildly overexcited Magyar nationalism. At first, in the decade following 1867, Austria was dominated by a liberalism of the usual kind, comparable to contemporary German liberalism. But toward the end of the 1870s, this regnant liberalism collapsed in Austria as well. Indeed, down to the very end, Habsburg feudalism got along excellently with the capitalists in heavy industry and finance. The firms that supplied the Danube monarchy with weapons and financial loans were unconditionally loyal to the emperor and sufficiently powerful as long as they used the necessary back stairs in Vienna. The influence of the middling liberal bourgeoisie of German extraction was systematically pushed back in Austria. Supported by a small and monarchist middle class and by the Catholic Church, Luga founded the mass party of Christian socialism. He was a first-rate agitator and mass organizer. He captured a majority in Vienna, allowed himself to be elected mayor of the imperial capital, and would eventually become leader of the strongest faction in the Austrian parliament, one on which the imperial regime was permanently dependent. Luga was a leader of the common man, der kleinen Leute. Finance capital had no... kleinen Leute, more like the small man. Finance capital had no direct connections with his party. The little guy. All right. Finance capital had no direct connections with his party. But in the later part of his life, Luga became a key supporter of the Habsburg monarchy, whose existence was in turn decisive to the fortunes of big business. It was a game with clear allocation of roles. Luga and his populist party, the Kaiser with his aristocratic ministers, and the big Vienna bankers all basically shared the same goals. The German intellectuals who lived in Austria, especially the younger ones, were deeply dissatisfied with their social position in the generation before the war. Longingly, they looked across the borders to Imperial Germany, where, under Hohenzollern dominance, young students had come to have a stake in Germany's drive to become a world power. In Austria, however, the regime generally favored Slavs to the detriment of ethnic Germans. Moreover, the Christian intelligentsia felt threatened by the lively competition of a considerable number of Jewish intellectuals. Austria's German youth would only too willingly have placed themselves in the service of a big power national imperialism, but the regime had no use for them. The Austrian regime was anything but German nationalist, Deutschnational, and Austrian high finance even less so. Thus, young people of German extraction who lived in Austria began to develop feelings of neglect and exclusion, at least some sections of them. Their German nationalism and their hatred of anything non-German was all the more virulent. This remarkable phenomenon of a whole layer of young German academics who in the years leading up to 1914 felt part of a subjugated and oppressed nationality was of course inconceivable in Wilhelmine Germany with its student clubs and reserve officers, but this type existed in Austria and in the pan-German and German nationalist student circles. Their ethnic romanticism and their sour racial resentments rubbed off onto sections of middle and working-class youth. It was from this background that Adolf Hitler came over to Germany, and in the new conditions that prevailed there after 1918, he certainly needed no lessons in nationalism. A demagogic nationalism simultaneously seeks an object through which it can daily demonstrate its own superiority and onto which it can release the delirium of its racial frenzy. Poor white people in the southern states of America hated the blacks, but at the same time they needed them because without their persecution of black people, they could not develop their own instincts. The same was true of the Turks in the period of Abdul Hamid's maltreatment of the Armenian population. The German youth of Bohemia stood in a position of equal strength vis-à-vis the Czechs, and the young Czech nationalists repaid the German nationalists in the same coin. However, especially useful and convenient object for such racism were the Jews. In the anti-liberal and nationalist mass movements of pre-war Europe described above, the Jewish question played an extraordinarily important role. The Russian lumpenproletariat could be as easily incited against the Jews as some of the intellectuals and the middle-class elements in Central Europe. The Union of True Russian Peoples basically survived on Jew-baiting. Luger built his Christian Social Party in the first instance by using anti-Semitic propaganda. When Reverend Stucker wanted to arouse a monarchist and Christian mass movement in Berlin, it was the Jews he attacked. French nationalism around the turn of the century was likewise sharply anti-Semitic. Here a contributory factor was the quite accidental circumstance that the struggle between different parties was passionately fought over the question of guilt or otherwise of the Jewish captain Dreyfus. One can therefore conclude that already before the war, in at least 4 of the 6 major countries of Europe, nationalist mass movements opposed to liberalism were bound up with hostility to the Jews. Moreover, in Austria, the German nationalists and Christian socialists vied with each other in their hatred for Jews. By contrast, in pre-war Hungary, no strong anti-Semitic mass movement ever developed. The wealthy Budapest Jews were friends of the ruling oligarchy. In Italy, where the number of Jews has never been significant, it was precisely Jewish families who were among the most active supporters of modern imperialism. Here, as in England, there was no purely political anti-Semitism. Concerning the form of state, the reactionary mass movements of Russia, Austria, Hungary, and Germany were unconditionally for the defense of the existing authoritarian monarchies and of all the values bound up with them. In France, the right was opposed to democracy, and at best put up with a republic as an unavoidable evil. The most extreme groups of French nationalism longed for a coup d'etat, and therefore either for military dictatorship or for a restoration of the monarchy itself. In Italy, the constitutional question was never actually posed prior to 1914. In England, the vast mass of workers and of the middle class were unconditional supporters of the parliamentary order. Here, any parliamentary group that toyed with the idea of dictatorship would have met with immediate political extinction. The Conservative Party was thus compelled to work within the parliamentary framework. Men such as Disraeli and Chamberlain were actually proud of winning parliamentary majorities. As you can see, the ideology, which is today called fascist, was already fairly widespread throughout Europe before the war, and exerted a strong influence on the masses. However, with one exception, what was missing then was the peculiar tactic of using stormtroopers, which is thoroughly characteristic of modern fascism. The sole exception was formed by the Black Hundreds of Tsarist Russia and their ability to stage pogroms. The stormtrooper tactic peculiar to fascism is really a quite curious social phenomenon. It appears to contradict all political logic. Of course, the use of violence by ruling classes against the classes they rule over is as old as the history of human civilization itself. In particular, the capitalist classes of Europe never hesitated to use the utmost harshness and mass bloodshed whenever their position of power was threatened by socialism or even just by popular movements for democracy. In 1848, and again in 1871, the French capitalist class suppressed the Parisian workers with a series of bloody massacres. From 1878 to 1890, Bismarck kept the German workers' movement shackled by his anti-socialist laws. Now it goes without saying that the ruling class uses its state apparatus for the exercise of force, for the state apparatus is there precisely for that purpose. The authorities, police, and judicial administration are there to combat subversion, and when those do not suffice, the army is brought in. In special emergencies, the ruling class can reinforce its state power by calling in volunteer forces or mercenaries, but even in those cases it is the official state power itself that struggles directly against the revolution with its own weaponry and laws. When the oppressed masses are weak, they put up either no resistance at all or weak resistance to the ruling class and state violence. When they feel stronger, then they too take up arms, and a civil war results. Popular uprisings disrupt the normal functioning of the state apparatus. Both sides take to arms and struggle to the very end. The picture is familiar from the English Revolution of the 17th century, the French Revolution of the 18th century, and the Russian Revolution in our own century. Stormtroopers of the fascist kind appear to match none of the normal permutations of the political struggle. Their very existence signifies that normal conditions no longer prevail. On the other hand, they do not form part of a state of open civil war either. Rather, political opponents of the government have become disagreeable to the authorities, but are not strong enough to pose the question of power in a frontal assault. The government and the ruling groups do not deploy the standard or regular state authorities against the opposition, but volunteer corps are recruited from the mass of the population to handle the job. They attack, ill-treat, or murder all persons who have become unpopular, destroy or plunder their property, and unleash a wave of persecution and terror calculated to drown all opposition. The activities of stormtroopers of the fascist type are in complete violation of the laws. Legally, the stormtroopers should be tried and sentenced to jail, but in fact nothing of the sort happens to them. Their conviction in the courts is pure show. Either they do not serve their sentence, or they are soon pardoned. In this way, the ruling class shows its stormtrooper heroes how grateful and sympathetic it is. Now, under what conditions is the political activity of stormtroopers possible? In the more recent history of Europe, the pogroms conducted by the Black Hundreds in Russia in October 1905 form the first clear and significant example of this phenomenon, which is today so familiar to us. The first condition of their appearance is a complete disintegration of the normal state power. As a rule, the ruling class does all it can to strengthen the official authority of the state. In its view, the state forms an embodiment of the general public interest. The judiciary is an expression of impartial justice. Respect for the state and its authorities, belief in the power of law, is one of the strongest weapons in the hands of the ruling class. It is only when a country is totally shaken by a crisis of revolutionary proportions, and when the ruling groups can no longer hope to survive with the help of the law and police administrations alone, that they begin to look around for other means. The government and authorities themselves avoid any direct attack on the revolutionaries, Democrats, Socialists, and Jews. But one day the anger of the people explodes, and the upright citizen who still believes in God, king, and country emerges, smashes the wicked rebels, and restores the power of legitimate authority. Yet, if the anger of the people had been real, there would never have been a crisis. Thus the rage of the patriotic masses has to be manufactured. In October 1905, faced with a powerful revolutionary upsurge of the masses, the Russian government did not dare to assemble its police and Cossack forces in order them to liquidate the Jews and the Socialists. On the other hand, with police help, a popular movement of patriotic, anti-liberal, anti-Semitic nature was created, and these stormtroopers were then let loose on Jews and revolutionaries. In this way, a certain division of labor emerged. The Tsarist regime was not directly and officially responsible for the shameful actions of the pogrom's heroes. One could thus retain a certain distance, at least in the image projected abroad and in the press, even as many officials and police chiefs openly defended the Black Hundreds. On the other side, there were many straightforward conservative supporters of the Tsar who wanted nothing to do with the pogroms. There were officials and even ministers who took a clear stance against the pogroms. It is by no means necessary that at any given moment the entire ruling class has to accept the stormtroopers and their methods of struggle. As a rule, there will be differences of opinion. The liberal bourgeoisie and certainly fastidiously authoritarian conservatives will condemn the stormtroopers and the methods of fascism. But it would be a disastrous mistake for the working class to suppose that such differences mean very much. Despite all tactical differences, the fascist stormtroopers belong with the ruling capitalists and feudal landlords as the flesh of their flesh. It is not true that in such periods there are three distinct forces in the state, ruling capitalists, fascists, and socialists who stand for democracy. Rather, there are always only two forces, the capitalists and the fascists on one side, the Democrats and socialists on the other. One damaging drawback of the theory of a petty bourgeois fascism is that it obscures this simple fact in the eyes of workers, for then the world looks like this. First there are the capitalists in power, next there is a petty bourgeois fascist opposition, finally there is the proletarian socialist opposition. With this threefold division, every conceivable trick and maneuver becomes possible, for example, an alliance of socialists with fascists against the ruling bourgeoisie, or a coalition of socialists with the liberal and upright and conservative capitalists against the fascists, or some other soap bubble of this kind. Illusions of this sort have been disastrous for the working classes of Germany, Italy, and other countries. In 1909, Trotsky wrote about the pogrom mobilizations of October 1905. For this crusade, the Russian government had enlisted its troops in every conceivable nook and cranny, from looker joints to brothels. Here you saw the petty shopkeeper and the tramp, the publican and his regulars, the house servant and the police spy, professional crooks and casual thieves, small craftsmen and brothel attendants, and the starving, intellectually desolate small peasant who had perhaps abandoned his home village only yesterday and whose head had been thoroughly confused by the din of factory machines. Initially, at the start of the Russo-Japanese War, the police had undertaken trial mobilizations of obscure masses, and these staged street demonstrations in favor of the government's war policy. Trotsky continues, from this time onwards, the consciously planned and organized mobilization of the scum of society witnessed an extraordinary development, and even if the greater mass of participants in the pogroms, if one can speak of mass here, remained a more or less fluctuating element, the core of this army was formed on a disciplined and organized military basis. This hard core received its slogans and watchwords from above and passed them on into the ranks below. It was also this core that decided the timing and scales of any murderous action that had to be organized. Here it is sufficient to draw out only those features of the Russian pogroms and the Black Hundreds that are relevant to a history of fascism. The Black Hundreds prepared their actions by first circulating their newspaper in the localities they hit upon. This was soon followed by the experts turning up on the scene, sent there from the other cities. Now the crucial rumors would start circulating. The Jews are planning an attack on all law-abiding Christians. The socialists have desecrated a holy image. The students have torn a picture of the Tsar to shreds. Then prescription lists would be posted up with the names of individuals and homes earmarked for plunder and demolition on a priority basis. On the notified day, the Black Hundreds would assemble, initially at the churches for some special service. This would be followed by a procession of fluttering national flags, during the whole of which a military band would play patriotic tunes without interruption. Slowly, the first window panes would be smashed, the first passers-by manhandled, then some shots would ring out, supposedly fired by socialists or Jews on peace-loving national demonstrators. A cry for revenge would sound loudly at this point, and a mayhem of unrestrained looting, assault, and murder would then erupt. The police are there, but they remain passive and are in no position to defend the victim of the people's pogrom. As soon as the Jews or the socialist workers mount an organized resistance, the police moves into action immediately. And if they think it is required, even the army intervenes. Every attempt by the workers to defend themselves is crushed, and the pogrom can continue. In the autumn of 1905, the Black Hundreds committed some 4,000 murders in hundreds of Russian towns, to say nothing of all their other crimes. As far as its scale is concerned, this movement of the true Russian peoples can certainly be compared with the more recent actions of the black shirts and the brown shirts. At a time of enormous revolutionary tension, when millions of workers were on strike in Russia, when in innumerable villages there were peasant rebellions and the soldiers and sailors were starting to mutiny, it was still possible for the ruling class to enlist hundreds of thousands of impoverished elements as stormtroopers of the counter-revolution. hatred of Jews, a stupid fanatical nationalism, bribery, and alcohol all combined to draw together such masses of the petty bourgeoisie, lumpen proletariat, and occasionally even the right-wing workers. The possibility of stealing and plundering with total impunity drove hordes of professional criminals into the storm troops. However, there was an additional factor, the powerful temptation for all impoverished individuals who had come down in the world to join the stormtroopers, for as members of these fascist bands that were tolerated by the authorities, they were suddenly wrenched from being non-entities to becoming powerful elements in whose hands lay the fate of their fellow human beings. On this point, too, Trotsky writes, with fine psychological insight, "Now this man without shoes has become king. An hour ago he was a trembling slave hounded by the police and by hunger. Now he feels like an absolute despot. He could do anything he likes. Everything will pass. He is master of life and death. If he feels the urge to do so, he throws an old woman from the window of the third floor to the pavements below. He smashes the skull of a baby with a chair. He rapes a small girl in front of a crowd of people. He shrinks from none of the tortures which only a brain driven mad with liquor and frenzy could contrive, for he can do anything he likes. Everything will pass. God bless the Tsar." Once the counter-revolution triumphed in Russia, the pogroms became unnecessary, and the ruling class returned to law and order. But the Russian example shows us that a ruling class or regime that can only keep itself alive through the terror spread by the storm troops is finally doomed to extinction. The systematic destruction of all existing notions of justice, order, and legality that the pogroms and stormtroopers bring about is something no one can forget. The next revolutionary wave brings with it a ruthless collapse and retaliation. After that bloody autumn of 1905, Nicholas II was no longer Tsar of all Russians by God's grace. He was only the dirty little chieftain of the Black Hundreds. The heroes of bygone pogroms could not save Tsarism. In no other European big power outside of Russia had the disintegration of state power prior to 1914 advanced to such a degree that the nationalist, anti-liberal movements would actually want to promote stormtrooper terrorism. It was the impact of the World War and general social crisis that dominated its aftermath in Europe that finally secured renewed space for the methods of the pogrom. That was the first section. The next section is on Italy, but I will pause here.